Hello and welcome back. This is the week 9 lecture. So now that we have finished with our process analysis essay, it's time to move on to our next writing genre or our next style. And that will be, of course, comparing and contrasting. I also want you guys to kind of think of this as comparative analysis. I will use that term a lot, kind of interchangeably, along with comparison and contrast. So, much like narrative, much like analysis, this is already pretty familiar to most of us, this style of thinking, this style of writing. We do it a lot, maybe not in a really formal academic manner, but this is really a way of thinking, and it's sort of a decision making tool that many of us use all the time. So of course, as we know, comparison is generally referring to, looking for similarities between two or more subjects. And then of course, with contrast, we are typically focusing on the differences between two or more subjects. So these typically go together, and doing this kind of comparative work is kind of instinctive. Like I said, we do it all the time, and it is a decision making tool. We use comparison and contrast when we're trying to choose between multiple options. And we know this, right? So when you're trying to decide which class to sign up for, or what to watch on TV or online, however you guys watch things, we're constantly making choices. Do I want A? Do I want B? Or do I want maybe C? Right now, of course, it's election season. So when we're choosing between two political candidates, right, we're using this method of thinking all the time for decisions both large and small. So when we're writing in this mode or in this style, typically we're doing one of two things. We are either trying to explain something about our subject, something based on similarities or differences or both. So we might be sort of focusing on an explanatory function. We're trying to explain something about our subjects to our readers. Or, and this is more of what kind of ultimately what we're going to be doing, we can evaluate. We can evaluate different subjects in order to establish their strengths and their weaknesses, and ultimately to determine which is best, which of the subjects is best or the most effective or the most suitable for us or for our audience. So as we get started in the near future on our own comparative analysis, we're going to be sort of satisfying both of those functions. We'll be explaining stuff, but ultimately we'll also be evaluating. And that's what I want you guys to remember. When we compare and contrast, it's a means to an end doing this kind of work. We're not just comparing and contrasting for the heck of it. Typically, we're using this method in order to generate content, in order to find things that we can then use to make larger points about our subjects, to make larger evaluations about our subjects. So that's kind of important to keep in mind, because after we work on comparing and contrasting for a little bit, we're going to be adding a few other sort of methods or techniques that we can use in addition to our comparative analysis in order to sort of, achieve our goals on the next essay assignment. Essay 3 will sort of be a little bit of a mixed bag. We're going to be doing several things, including comparison. So it's a means to an end. It's a tool that will allow us to sort of accomplish bigger goals. So one thing you got to remember, and I think I talk about this in the overview. Actually, I don't think I do, so let me make sure I talk about it now. And I'll add this to the overview. When you're choosing your subjects, you need to make sure that they belong to the same general class or category. And again, this is kind of common sense. I think most of us already know this, but when you're trying to conduct a comparison, you need two subjects that are at least somewhat similar. Now, obviously, you don't want them to be the exact same or too similar, because that might not give you a lot to do, but they need to belong to the same general class. So again, going back to politics, you can obviously compare two presidential candidates And you can look at their strengths, and you can look at their weaknesses, and you can evaluate them, and you can make some decisions about who you want to support. And in a similar way, you can compare to movies. And if you guys have been to the Week 9 module, you've already seen that we have a lot of movie stuff in the module, which I think is fun. I like movies, and in honor of Halloween, I've put a few horror movie clips, and I'll talk more about those clips a little bit later. But you can obviously compare different movies. You can compare even similar shots in different movies, and I'll talk more about that. You guys may have seen the tracking shot examples that I've already posted. So obviously that makes sense. But you wouldn't want to compare a presidential candidate to a movie. Because, right? And I don't think anybody would want or try to do that. But those belong to different classes, right? Those are two different as far as the subjects that we can choose. They just don't have enough in common. And in a similar vein, I mean, you could compare really any politician, but it makes sense to kind of have a hierarchy or an organizational sort of, or just some kind of classification system that you can sort of keep handy in order for the comparisons to really work. So like I said, you can compare two presidential candidates. That makes a lot of sense, but it would be a little harder to compare a presidential candidate to like a local politician running for local, like statewide office in Nevada, or a gubernatorial candidate in a particular state, or a mayor. But we could still do it, right? I mean, all politicians are going to have certain things in common. They might have similar positions on certain issues. They could also, of course, have key differences on the issues. But the best comparison would be between two people running for the same office, or two people sort of operating on the same level, the presidential level or the gubernatorial level or the sort of city level. Those would be the easiest comparisons to do, but we could really do at least some kind of comparative work with any two politicians. It might just get a little bit more difficult the further apart they are in terms of their level or where they are in the country, but we could still do it as long as we have two politicians. Same with movies. Like the easiest comparative work would be to take two movies from the same genre, right? Two horror movies, two comedies, two action films, right? That would be the easiest type of comparison to do, but really, we could compare any two movies because they are movies, right? And they belong to the same general class, even if they're different genres, different subject matter, etc. So you guys kind of already know all of that. What was I going to say? Oh yeah, points of comparison. This is probably the most important concept that I want to talk about this week. And I do have this definition in the overview. This is kind of the most important part of what we're going to be doing when we compare. And I want you guys, when you're thinking about points of comparison, I want you to think about the individual parts and elements of our process or complex action that we were working with previously, because the points of comparison operate in a very similar way to those individual parts and elements that we were analyzing with our processes. So the points of comparison are going to be basically the characteristics or the qualities, the particular aspects of your subjects that you are most interested in, and they are the things that you want to explore. They are the specific areas that you are actually going to be comparing and contrasting. Because that's the thing about doing this kind of work. You have to get specific and focused and detailed. So you have to have key characteristics or elements that you can really sort of dig into, sink your teeth into and explore. And this will give you the basic organization, the basic organizational structure of your larger comparison. So let me give you an example. Going back to our presidential candidates. So of course, there are a lot of things that we can compare. Just like with the process analysis, much of what you have to do is kind of figure out what your focus is going to be. What aspects of your subjects are you most interested in? So if I want to evaluate two presidential candidates, I have to decide really first, what are the issues that matter the most to me? What do I care about the most? because of course there's a lot of different ways to evaluate these candidates. So I can select, let's say, 3 points of comparison that I really want to focus on. So maybe I decide that the most important things to me are healthcare, education, obviously, that one makes sense, and then maybe, I don't know, I'm just making these up, the personal integrity of the candidates, right? Those are the 3 most important things to me when it comes to choosing my presidential, my choice for president. So those are my points of comparison. So now I'm going to examine each of my subjects in those 3 particular areas. Where do they both stand on healthcare? Where do they both stand? What are their similarities and differences in education? And then how do they stack up in terms of personal integrity, or however I define that third quality. So those are my points of comparison. And if I wanted to write this, much like the kind of work we're going to be doing, I could simply use those points of comparison just like we used our individual elements on Essay 2. I can use those to organize my body paragraphs. I can use those, like I said, to kind of give my comparison an overall structure. So as you guys are looking through these movie clips that I've posted in the Week 9 module, you need to you need to make your own choices and select your own points of comparison. And I'll give you a few options at the end of this lecture, but that's kind of the first step as a viewer or as a reader. Sometimes you're going to need to select the areas that are most interesting or most important to you that you really want to examine. So if we're looking at those horror movie clips, I'll just go ahead and speak about those briefly. One thing that I think you guys should think about would be like physical spaces. Because if you watch those 2 horror clips, you'll notice that there's a lot going on with hallways and doorways and specific rooms. We're very much inside in both of those clips. So again, if I were doing this work, I would think about physical spaces or setting, potentially physical setting. If you remember that from our narrative unit, that might be one point of comparison, but you can get as broad or as specific as you want, really. Maybe I'm interested in the acting in the 2 clips, because you'll notice one is from a very old movie from the 1920s, Nosferatu, which is a German film, and it's one of the earliest vampire movies. It's not Dracula, but that creepy, ghoulish guy that's creeping around in the film, he's a vampire, is the idea. So that's an old film, and then we have a much more contemporary film. So you might be interested in how the acting techniques have changed over time. Nosferatu is a silent movie. So the actors really kind of have to overact, or at least that's what it seems like to us, because that's how they convey emotion, and there's no talking, right? I mean, they have to sort of do everything they do talk and there is dialogue, but like there's no actual like speaking. You can't hear them talk. This was before sound films came around, so they have to kind of communicate everything through facial facial features and like gestures and so you might be interested in acting. You might also be interested in the monsters. So we have the nun, and then we have the creepy vampire guy. There's really limitless options. You might think about lighting. You might think about the way the camera moves. You might think about music. Could be another interesting point of comparison. We hear music in each of the clips. So again, you get to choose your points of comparison, and then you can really start getting into similarities and differences, and you're really conducting, again, analysis. I want you guys to think about this as another form of analysis. Comparative analysis. So again, we're still trying to break our subjects down to understand them, to arrive at original conclusions about them. But then remember, we're also ultimately going to be evaluating them and making decisions about which is best or which is the most effective or whatever. So I also mentioned in the overview that you'll need a thesis, of course. This is largely true of every type of writing that we're going to be doing from here on out. You need some kind of point, all right, some kind of argument. And again, we are making arguments with Essay 3, largely based on our comparative work. So just keep that in mind. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap up. I don't want to make this lecture particularly long because it really doesn't need to be this week. But let me just talk a little bit about the movies. And I really encourage you guys to watch all of those clips. They're brief, obviously. It's not, I didn't post, entire films. I just want you guys to do some comparative work using those clips. So there's really three groups. There are, like I said, there's two horror films that that I've embedded into the Week 9 overview. So go ahead and check those out. I've already talked about those. I've given you some potential points of comparison. So you can start, again, looking for similarities, looking for differences in each one of those points, and arrive at some conclusions. Make some decisions. Oh yeah, before I get into the movies, I'm sorry, I forgot the one other thing I wanted to mention, which is your two choices when it comes to organizational structure. And this is in the Week 9 overview. But when you're sort of putting all of this together, you have two ways to really organize. You can go subject by subject, or you can go point by point. And the names kind of say it all. So if you have two subjects, two movies, for example, and you choose the subject by subject organizational method, then obviously you're going to talk about the first subject first, so the first movie, Nosferatu, and we're going to cover all of our points of comparison in relation to that movie. So if I chose music, acting, and physical spaces, we're going to talk about all three of those things in Nosferatu. And then we're going to move on to our next subject, The Conjuring, and we're going to cover those same 3 points of comparison in relation to The Conjuring. That's subject by subject. The other option is point by point. So now we're organizing based on the points themselves. So if I want to start with acting, I'll devote some paragraphs to acting in which I discuss both movies. And then I move on to, what was my other one? Physical space. And I cover both movies in physical space, and then I move on to my third point. So pretty simple, but you need to be aware that those two options exist, and you need to pick one, ultimately, when you're putting all of this stuff together. So let's just talk about the movies, the other ones. So you know about the horror films. I've given you some potential points of comparison for those. But then I also posted some links on the main module page. So I put a couple of trailers up there, Goodfellas and The Irishman. So just to provide a little bit of context, I know a lot of us probably aren't terribly interested, but those are two films directed by Martin Scorsese, who's kind of a famous American filmmaker, and they're obviously similar. I mean, they're both crime dramas, gangster movies, essentially. And if you watch the trailers, you'll notice that some of the same actors are in both movies. Robert De Niro, you might recognize another face or two. But I also want you to think about differences. There are obvious similarities there, but there's also differences based on time, based on when the movies were made. You might notice that they are separated by a fair amount of time. If you know anything about Goodfellas, it's a pretty famous movie, but it's not exactly current anymore. And The Irishman just came out maybe a year ago. You'll also notice that the actors themselves, of course, are older now. So, again, it's kind of interesting to see the similarities and differences because it's the same filmmaker, it's the same genre, and it's even a lot of the same actors, but there's a different tone, I would argue. They are quite different movies, and if you've seen the two movies, of course, that helps. But you can just also take my word for it. They are both about gangsters, but they have a different sort of treatment of that material, which I think even comes through in the trailers. So again, I won't say anything more, but watch the trailers and then pick your points of comparison. It could be actors, it could be violence, I don't know, it could be anything about the crime movie genre that jumps out at you. But pick your points of comparison and then start sorting through the similarities and differences within each one. And then the other clips that I want you to check out that I think are really cool if you have the time, they are 3 tracking shots. 3 famous tracking shots from 3 pretty well-known movies. I mean, one very contemporary movie, but it's a famous franchise, and then 2 other famous movies from yesteryear. In fact, one is Goodfellas. One comes from Goodfellas, a famous shot from that film. So just in case you don't know, a tracking shot just means it's any shot in a movie. It's a camera shot where the camera is like following the subject. So the camera is like moving forward or backwards, or sometimes moving alongside the subject, the actor or actors being filmed. And often the camera will be like mounted on a dolly and it's moving around. It's hard to describe. You'll notice it as soon you'll recognize it as soon as you start watching those clips. These are well-known shots. You see them in a lot of movies, but these are 3 really impressive, long-lasting tracking shots. And I want you to notice that they're all continuous shots. I mean, if you guys all watch movies, so you probably know, or at least you watch shows on TV, which often look very similar. So you know that the typical camera shot in a film or a show is very short, on average, maybe like 3 to 5 seconds. You'll notice the editing if you're actually looking for it. Most shots are a very short duration, right? Close up of a face, shot of an object or when 2 people are talking, we might be cutting back and forth between the 2 very quickly. So most shots don't last very long because we have short attention spans, and usually we need to keep seeing different things. But what makes tracking shots cool is you can have long, unbroken, continuous tracking shots without the audience getting bored because the camera is moving. So we can still see a lot of different stuff. And it's like we're with the characters. It's like we're moving with the characters. We're following them. And in all 3 of these movies, the characters are moving through interesting stuff. They're walking amongst crowds, or they're walking in interesting places. So we get to see all of that as the camera follows them. So just kind of a cool cinematic technique. I think it's cool. I don't know if you guys do. But watch those 3 tracking shots because there's some really obvious similarities that will jump out at you immediately. So when you're looking for points of comparison, again, think about the actors. Think about just anything that you see on screen, really. But you can also think about specific ways the camera is moving, ways that it might be kind of going overhead, or you might notice similar movements. Also, I'm just going to throw out some ideas. You might think about Mexico. In at least 2 of the 3 clips, Mexico might come into play. You might think about music. Again, music plays an underrated role in movies. And a lot of these scenes or clips that we see, there is some kind of music in the background, oftentimes. So you could think about that. And I'm just going to throw out couples, the word couples. I'm not going to say anything else. So you can look for some obvious similarities. Couples as in a couple, like 2 people. So that's all. So look for similarities, look for differences. And again, the movies are all from different time periods. So we have James Bond, I think the most recent Bond. So it's contemporary, it's fresh, everything looks new. Then we have Touch of Evil, which is from the 1950s. It's a famous kind of classic film, so it's black and white, it's old, it's going to look a lot different. And then we have Goodfellas, which came out in 1990, so it's not old necessarily, but it is, it's 30 years old. And you'll notice that the setting, like Goodfellas came out in 1990, but it's set in like the 50s and 60s. That's the time period when we're talking about setting. So you might notice that with the music and some of the clothes when you're watching that clip. So anyway, that's enough about all of that. But watch the clips and think about what points of comparison you want to analyze. And again, there's just so many. Like I forgot to mention with the horror films, you can think about shadows. Shadows play, I think, an important role. Makeup. Whatever you like. Like I said, there's lots of options, but pick maybe 3 I think a good number to shoot for is 3. Select 3 points of comparison and then just jot down some similarities and differences for the 3 tracking shots, the 2 Scorsese trailers, and of course the 2 horror films. And happy Halloween. I will see you guys next week as we continue to sort of add to our tool belt. We're going to add a few new techniques that we can put together with comparison as we get closer to Essay 3. Okay, see you next time.